It's our great joy to present to you Julieanna Hever and Cronise. Julieanna is the original plant-based dietitian, and she's an author, she's a television host, she travels around the world speaking, and she's energetic and enthusiastic and knowledgeable, and we're so delighted to welcome her. And we're also delighted to welcome Mr. Cronise. And Ray is a former NASA scientist who has turned his scientific mind and his ingenuity toward plant-based living and health. And so please join me in welcoming them here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? Great. Well, thank you so much, Pastor Jensen, and for Susan for bringing us out, and for all of you for being here tonight. I haven't been here in many years, and it's so nice. It feels like coming home. It's so comfortable and wonderful here, and I'm excited to introduce my new partner in plants, Cronise. I want to tell you a little quick glimpse about our little story, because it kind of changed my whole pathway about 3 years ago, and it's actually perfectly represented by the title of our talk tonight, the intersection between Healthspan and a plant-based diet. So I was going around the world saying some crazy things like carbs are not a food group. And, I was doing my own thing, and I published a paper in the Permanente journal in 2016, and he printed it out, and he wrote on it, "Finally someone gets it!" Exclamation point, exclamation point, exclamation point. Well, it turns out he'd been going around the world saying crazy stuff, and he had a meme also. We both had memes that said carbs are not a food group. And it was like, oh my gosh, there's another crazy person out there like me. And so we kind of put our heads together, and what I was teaching with plant-based nutrition, and he was talking about and looking at the Healthspan and longevity data. Wow, what a confluence occurred when we put them all together. So we redid the Plant-Based Nutrition Idiot's Guide. It just published in January, and we are really excited because we just did our final edits on the Healthspan Solution, which will be coming out in December. It's our first full-color, hardcover cookbook, 100+ recipes, and we'll talk a little bit about it because we're going to talk about everything that we're going to give you a little glimpse of it today, and even a couple of recipes. It's the world's premiere of these 2 recipes. So I will let Raymond kick it off with the really interesting Healthspan and longevity data, and then I will pick it up with nutrition, and we will answer all of your questions afterwards. So, Raymond, take it away.
Well, thank you. Welcome. We're going to do a few things that may challenge the way everyone thinks about food. Actually, real quick, how many people are already full-bore plant-based? Okay, and now how many people are plant-curious? Okay. So we want to do some things to help do that. So first thing I want you to do is I want everybody to do the praying hands. We're in church, why not, right? So this is the best place I've ever gotten to do this demo. And if you look down, either your right thumb is over your left thumb or your left thumb is over your right thumb. If your right thumb's over, put your hands up. Okay. If your left thumb is over your right thumb, put your hands up. Okay. So now what I want you to do is notice that if you put your hands together, they're exactly symmetrical, right? They're perfect. It doesn't matter which way you do that. But I want you to reverse it. If your right was over your left and your left were over right, I want you to reverse it and do it the other way. Now what's really interesting is that feels weird. And the reason why is you've been doing this since you were in the womb, and you've got a habit. Now, if you do this long enough, this will feel normal because there's no difference between your right hand and left hand in terms of their symmetry. No reason one way should feel better than the other. That's purely your brain playing a trick on you, okay? So when something happens, when somebody says something, when they're talking about something and it feels a little uncomfortable, sometimes we interpret that as it being wrong. But it may just be that there's this little perception. And if you do that new thing long enough, you'll find that that will become your new habit. And part of what Julieanna and I do is teach lots of different people and our clients and people we work with how to take this lifestyle and bring it from something that you start with to something that just feels normal. And it does take a while to do that. So we're going to talk a little bit about Healthspan, and this is a little bit of a different subject. So what I want you to think about is that in terms of human evolution, in terms of what we've been doing, you can eat almost anything and make it to 15. How many people have teenagers? Right? And you'll make it to reproductive age, right? And you can eat a lot of things and make it through that next 15 to 20 years of reproductive prime, right? And then if we just go ahead and add another 15 years on the end to raise your youngest offspring, somewhere around 45 or 50, evolution and Mother Nature are done with us. You know? So anybody that talks about an ancestral diet or a paleo diet or anything of the past, that gets you to the end, but you've passed on your genes. There's no feedback loop for those diseases we're all sitting in the chair thinking about, those things that will take away those really productive years when we have the most wisdom, the most knowledge, the most to offer, you know, our friends, our family, and society, and then whap, you know, then you start to do this slow death. So what we did eat is important. What can we eat? That's what made humans amazing, that we were able to eat so many different kinds of diet. So when you see somebody presenting a different kind of diet and saying, well, I saw some short-term success, the question is that the kind of success that would have been great for evolution, but really bad for the end of your life, meaning, you know, you die slow and expensively? And the question that Julieanna and I are looking at is really, what should we eat? In other words, what should we eat so that those years above 45 or 50 become the healthiest years, so that you're able to live long and die fast, and maybe live a little longer and live a little longer. We'll talk a little bit about that too. So this is the difference between health span and lifespan. What we're really talking about is that period of life. We want to extend that period of life of healthy living. So, you know, the difference between these two curves, you see the other things we said, the reproductive prime. So the question is are you going to have that fast curve down, and you see that where you start to lose your ability to walk, or your ability to think, or, you know, skin, hair, all these things start to decline, and eventually these things are aggregated when we think about death. And maybe another picture that gives you a better idea is that, you know, throughout time, that first bar, where we lived about the same amount of time now, healthy years, and then we died pretty fast. We didn't have antibiotics. We didn't have emergency medicine. We didn't have the sanitation. Those things, for the most part, were what extended our lives to the kinds of years we see today. Those people that lived beyond that, even 100 years ago, 200, 500 years ago, they could live as long as we did if one of those other things didn't get them. That second line is where we are now. We're living longer, but we're living sicker. And so one of the things that we really want to be able to do is, you know, decrease that red bar first. So right now, over the next decade, things that are happening, the kinds of things you guys hear here with diet, we will show you today why those intersect with the research that's being done by scientists, and that's important. But also, there's going to be some pharmacological interventions as well. As Julieanna and I started, the first sentence of our new book is, you can't live forever eating carrots. So you're not going to be immortal eating carrots. That isn't enough. We will have to do some pharmacological interventions at the cellular level so that people can live a longer life. But it is possible, and we're already doing it with organisms. After that next thing, probably eventually, we'll be starting to extend the green bar too. So we might live longer and longer and longer. There isn't a biological limit to how long we can live. And when we look at a lot of organisms, and we think about this aging, what we find is that we do see organisms like the Hydra that is basically immortal. It's a single cell organism. If you cut it in half, both halves regenerate the other half, and they just live on and on and on. Tortoises and whales and trees, there's lots of biological cells that live a lot longer than humans. There's ones that live shorter, right? Our pets, some of our pets live shorter, right? So the idea is that if we could figure out why some organisms can regenerate a limb, for example, the tail on a lizard, why can they do it? Because every part of you was generated from a single cell, right? At one point, your retina cells and your liver cells were no different. So when we talk about aging, there's really two things. There is this outward part of aging that everybody would recognize that someone's aged, but then there's this other part of aging that we need to talk about, which is at the cellular level. We want to talk about both those today, but one of the things that motivates me is, I saw a presentation by a person who lives not too far from here, and he had these boxes, and what this is 30 by 32 boxes. It's 960 boxes that represent every month you're alive until the average lifespan of about 80 years old. That's how long humans live across the world, about 80 years, right? And when you start coloring these boxes in, and this gets Julieanna pretty upset, but when you color these boxes in, what you realize is as you're coloring them in, like the chart's full. So in 1 month, I'm gonna turn 55. And I don't have as many boxes as I like. And I'm sure there's people here that have even less boxes, like, hurry up. You know, you got to get more healthy, right? But so the first idea is to live all of those boxes I have left as healthy and as full as I want to do. And so that's part of the message you guys hear week after week in terms of the plant-based diet side, which is how can we hijack these things that we learn about plants, how can we hijack this to live them healthy? Eventually, I would like to create more boxes. But this is a way to actually, if you take some graph paper and color this in, it really sort of shows you how much is there when you look at how much was I in college, how much was in school, what was this relationship, what was this business, what was this company I worked for. And it ends up being these tiny little streaks, and they're so significant in your mind, and you forget about the ones ahead of you. You know, you dwell on the things that happened in the past and you forget about it. So this is about optimizing the boxes. And so when we look at aging, there are three major theories about what we age, or that's what we've distilled down to. One of them will be somewhat familiar to people, which is called this mutation accumulation, which is our genes get mutated over time. And eventually, when I said, you know, that retina cell is different from a liver cell, eventually you get liver cells sort of growing in your brain. You know, your cells start expressing certain genes that are not supposed to, and this is what cancer, in a very simplistic, overly simplistic way, this is kind of what tumors are. Is it cells that are got the go-go-grow, that reproductive prime, they didn't get the memo, and they grow into this big mass that ends up causing other kinds of issues. But this idea that was it, that there was this accumulation, and that something called senescence, which is a cell's just natural programmed death, something called senescence is a result of these accumulation of these defects in genes. The second one's called antagonistic pleiotropy, and basically what that says is that those things that are those genes, or there are genes that could be very beneficial when you're young, happen to be a problem when you're old. In other words, that a gene can have more than one, confer more than one attribute on your body, and in the early ages it would be beneficial for you. In the later ages it would be detrimental. An example is growth. You know, when we're young, growing, having high growth hormone, high insulin level, high levels of something called insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, these are all fantastic. When you're old and those things are all elevated, this is one of the things that is at the basis of breast cancer, colorectal cancer, prostate cancer. Lots of cancers do that, which is what, and we'll talk a little bit about the dairy, but that's one of the reasons dairy has a negative attribute, because when you're young, it is hormonally active and it's pushing your body to grow like you would expect breast milk would do, right? But when you drink and continue to consume this over a lifetime, that go-go-grow thing is now at some point a disadvantage. And then the last thing is this thing called the disposable soma. And the biggest idea here is just simply that your body is constantly running a trade-off between maintenance, your metabolism, your reproduction, and repair. In other words, your body has to make choices because, again, you're a go-go-grow reproducing machine. That's what you are at your basis level, at your cellular level. And when you're in the chronically fed state all the time, when your body's constantly in that go-go-grow mode, but you're done reproducing and et cetera, then your body doesn't have the time to do some of the cellular repairs. So with those three models of aging comes this new idea of really this cellular senescence of organisms. And so where you probably are most familiar with this would be, for example, in the leaves of a tree. So when we think about the leaves of a tree, what we know is that these leaves, they come out in the spring, right? They're synced with the seasons, they grow, they photosynthesize and produce energy for the tree all summer long. And then as fall comes, right now, you know, we start to see them starting to age and brown, and then they wither away and fall away because those same leaves could be a real detriment when the sun is down and they're not producing a lot of energy for the plant, and a winter storm comes and ice comes and is on the leaves. Those leaves collect that ice and it breaks off branches. So dropping the leaves because it's just not worth it to photosynthesize right now, right? You know, sometimes we do that when we're talking about, you know, with school and study. It's like, it's not worth it to do this right now. I'm going to go do something else, right? So these leaves are an example, but all cells do that. There's something called a half-life limit for human cells, and a cell can reproduce 52 times, and then it senesces at the end. And we're trying to push those cells beyond that by triggering some of those mechanisms. But what's really interesting is that if you look at the shape of these curves, and these curves are basically the health and decline of various organisms. So we're talking about, I don't know what to do with glasses. We're talking about yeast, worms, mice, and humans. And what you see is the time scale is different on these things, but in terms of actually the shape of the curve of the decline, it looks surprisingly similar. And so scientists now are using these organisms to be able to interrogate or figure out where those genes are. And we've actually identified at least 7 of these genes. So for example, and we'll see this in another slide here, for example, these genes, oh, sorry about that. Keynote updated last week, and for some reason this thing always does this at that point. Let's see if we can get through it this way. So these genes, these genes are involved in packing and unpacking your DNA. Your DNA in every cell is about 6 feet long, 2 meters. And if you could stretch out the DNA of every cell in your body that has DNA, it would be over 9 billion kilometers, over 10 billion kilometers, meaning end to end, it would be wider than our particular universe is wide. Okay, so you can imagine all that in. Now, a little bit of those genes get unpacked, and you can see this little structure in a chromosome. These genes get unpacked, and the body reads those genes. They're like blueprints, and it produces things that you need to do, and then it puts them back away. And what you see over here on the right side of the screen is the chromatin of a yeast cell, and you can see that we can see in yeast cells that these genes get scrambled in a different way. So instead of them being all cut and spliced, they're just like more like a messy office. You know, if you could come in there and give it a good cleaning every now and then, you might be able to actually live a lot longer. And that's what we're finding, that these certain compounds, they're called sirtuin activating compounds, a lot of compounds that we're finding in plants, but also some that we've identified from a pharmacological perspective that we can do, will actually help repack these things in a neat way. So what we want to try to do here is talk on a bigger level. And one of them didn't show up, did it? Talk on a bigger level. I'm going to try something real quick. Let me just see something. Nope, it's not there. Talk on a larger level about food. And so everybody's familiar with the protein, carbs, and fat. And getting back to Julieanna's story of protein's not a carb group, or protein's not a food group, and carbohydrates aren't food groups. You know, all living things have some variations of these things, and most of our foods have percentages of them. And while they were very interesting to study a century ago, these food groups kind of stuck. And it turns out that things that have the same amount of those larger categories don't necessarily react the same way metabolically. For example, most people would probably agree that eating an apple is not the same as drinking apple juice, right? Does that seem obvious to most people, right? In other words, they're both the same thing. It's the energy from both of them are coming from the exact same sugar, but packaged as the whole food, it reacts very different. Okay? And so we find this in a lot of foods, especially in what we call proteins. Proteins are composed of 20 amino acids, and of those amino acids, about 9 of them you must get from diet. In fact, every animal has to get them from diet, because animals don't make all 20, but plants do. because plants don't eat. Most plants don't eat. I get stopped on the Venus fly trap person, heckler, wherever you are, I gotcha. So most plants don't eat, right? They don't run, let's just say that. So the point is, animals concentrate nutrition, they don't create it. But the nutrition we need is in those plants. You may have to eat more of them, but it turns out those 9 amino acids that we talked about, those 9 amino acids that are restricted in plant foods, meaning they're not limited, they're not deficient, but they're in lower quantities. It turns out that those 9 amino acids happen to overlap with the exact ones we restrict in the lab to make organisms live longer, like methionine. You know, there's certain cancers, like breast cancer, has absolute methionine dependency. And what that means is, when we take breast cancer cells and put them in a petri dish, and we take breast tissue cells and we restrict them from methionine, breast tissue cells just substitute, move on their way. They're happy. Cancers, boom, they're stopped in their track. Where do we find methionine? Chicken and fish, huge. Chicken, fish, eggs, huge methionine sources. You know, might be, I don't know this for sure, but it might be that when all this push went to stop eating red meat as if the color mattered, we switched over to a kind of food that was higher in methionine, and that may explain some of the uptick in cancers. Maybe, you know, we're not sure about that, but it's certainly restricting it works. So my colleagues and I came up with another diagram, which was called the food triangle. And then Julieanna and I have written some papers on it as well, and books. And the idea is to separate food in a fundamentally different way. So at the top, we have leafy greens, cruciferous vegetables, stems like celery and asparagus, mushrooms, bulbs like garlic, onion, etc. Those things are the foundational food. Those are the things you eat in very large quantities because, hey, everybody likes, those like me that were overweight, we like to eat, and eating's over when you swallow and you want another bite, right? Those are the things you can eat huge volumes of. Now, each descending side of the food triangle, what we find is that we get our energy sourced from plant foods on one side. This would be fruits, starchy vegetables, cereals, legumes. Those kinds of things are where we find energy. Nuts and seeds are a little bit different. They're over on the plant side, but a lot of their energy comes from fat. But they're over there on the plant side. And on the animal side, on the right side of the food triangle, what we have is our typical animal source foods. And what's really interesting, remember what I said, animals concentrate nutrition, they don't really create it. And fuzzy things and green things concentrate nutrition in a fundamentally different way. And we can use this to our advantage because, as it turns out that, we'll show these papers later, as it turns out that when we actually look at a diet and we think about what are the traditional recipes we've eaten, what are the things that are normal? Well, you know, humans just made this up. There's no such thing as chicken pot pie. There's no such thing as mayonnaise. I mean, we just make it up. It's white stuff. You know, I have a different thing that I call mayo that I make out of cashews, and I spread it on tomato sandwiches in the summer, and it probably doesn't taste like Duke's, which used to be my favorite mayonnaise, but it tastes like some white creamy thing, right? But we just make it up. We get used to it. Remember that habit that we're talking about? Well, when we look at these diets, you know, somebody might have a friend said, oh, they did the paleo, they did the keto diet, and they lost weight, and they feel a lot better. Well, they might. They actually might, because what we predict is, hey, if you actually cut out either side of this, because if you think about it, let's talk about what we call bottom feeding. Steak and potatoes, burgers and fries, pasta and meat sauce, right? Curry and rice. All traditional recipes are combinations from the bottom, because when food is economically scarce, that's actually the most biologically efficient way to store away eat something for now and store away a little for later. The problem we have today is later never comes. And we're in the chronically fed state. I say, so our society is a society of one meal that takes breaks to work and sleep. Everything else you do with people is food. And so if you're always bottom feeding, that's the way you're gonna get the most amount of energy. And down each descending side, whether it's paleo or a vegan side, what we do is we cut out a lot of that energy. So remember what I said was that, by restricting those calories, we're one of the ways that we kick in those survival genes. Don't reproduce now There's not a lot of food. There's not a lot of energy. Preserve yourself for later when your offspring are going to survive. So that's one way to think about this. And our food triangle predicts this. And one of the things Julieanna can talk about a little bit with this nutrition section is that, if we add excess refined sugars, refined oils, salts, flours, etc., we can take that natural restriction of the plant-based side and make it just as unhealthy. And so what we're trying to do is, and we'll talk about this with our recipes, we're also going to break some rules there, right? So tonight, we'll talk about that, but we can do some things to sort of hijack our taste buds in a positive way so that we can really make all of that plant food taste a lot better without getting into bottom feeding and out getting into overnutrition. So our message is really simple. Once you learn that food triangle, you just keep eating right, so we just eat to the right of the food triangle. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Julieanna to talk a little bit about the nutrition stuff, and then we'll come back and do a demo for you guys.
So if we're not worrying about protein, carbs, and fat, and we're not worried about getting more, basically we want to change the mindset to maybe less is more, right? If you look at all of this research, and maybe that is precisely where this intersection comes from. This is precisely one of the major reasons that a whole food plant-based diet is so incredibly efficacious in optimizing your nutrition and long-term health. And we'll talk about all of the incredible benefits at the end. But how many of you have a loved one or a friend or a family member, someone who has been suffering from scurvy or rickets, pellagra, beriberi? Have any of you ever met anyone that had one of those conditions? Right? Okay, now, how many of you know someone that's had high blood pressure? High cholesterol? Type 2 diabetes? Trying to lose weight and can't lose weight? Right? My practice is flooded with the latter population. And yet, when I was in graduate school, and when I was doing my dietetic internship, and when I was working my rotations at the hospital, the entire paradigm is set on a deficiency model. Where are we going to get our fill in the blank? And everyone is so concerned about getting enough that it has quite literally had the opposite backlash effect, and we are dealing with this onslaught of chronic overnutrition. So I feel like kind of a crazy dietitian to say, I'm not so worried about where you get all of these nutrients. And if you look at all of the DRIs that the Institute of Medicine used, all of those things are based on averages, and the intention was completely to avoid deficiency. But we're not seeing those deficiencies. It's quite a paradox. So it's basically like this big paradoxical situation that's existing with a completely different context that we didn't plan for 50, 60 years ago. This is the first time in history, I think it was 2011, that overnutrition overtook undernutrition around the world. So there are more people now overnourished than malnourished around the world, and yet we're still very concerned about malnourishment. So if less is more, we basically have to think about maybe a few vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients and not worry so much about everything else. But that said, let me reassure you that eating in a completely plant-based diet, you can get enough. And even the head organization, the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics, had their second position paper on vegetarian diets come out. And actually, that's the bit.ly link. We like bit.ly links, so it's case sensitive. And that's how you can get this PDF online, so you can look at it and see it to show all the doctors and dietitians that are worried about you eating this way. But it states, and I quote, that appropriately planned vegetarian, including plant-based or vegan diets, are healthful, nutritionally adequate, and may provide health benefits for the prevention and treatment of certain diseases. These diets are appropriate for all stages of the life cycle, including pregnancy, lactation, infancy, childhood, adolescence, older, adulthood, and for athletes. And I have to say that this seems so okay. And when you look at the health benefits, which we're going to talk about, why wouldn't you want to attempt this? But I've been getting into some of these Facebook dietitian groups just to see what the other dietitians are saying. I don't know, just trying to get involved. And like the other day, someone posted, I have a client coming in and she went vegan and she's pregnant and I don't know what to do. And all these dietitians are, why would she want to go vegan when she would go pregnant? She's taking care of another life. On and on and on. And all these dietitians were really worried about this patient who was vegan. And first of all, it is completely safe. I've watched many babies live their full lives or long lives. I haven't watched that. Totally on plan. So it's reassuring to know that even the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics supports this. So you can get everything you need. But knowing all of that, how many of you are tired of seeing all of these words pop up in the media all the time, right? Bad fats, good fats, like the other day with the red meat's back. Oh my gosh, here we go again, right? This crazy study you guys hear about, that's new. The new study, right? It's not anything. But it's just, we like to call it biochemical befuddlement because it is so confusing. And what we talk about with the macronutrients, we call it macro confusion. Because if you're sitting there worried about, A, where are you gonna get your protein, what's a good fat versus a bad fat, everyone's just like, forget it, I'm just gonna go to McDonald's or whatever and eat whatever they want because it's so confusing, right? How many of you felt so confused that it's just like, forget it, right? Even I get confused like that, and I've been studying this for 20-something years. So it's to the detriment of our, our intentions to do better. All of us want to do just better. So what we are trying to do, what Ray and I are trying to do with all of our work is to bring this back into simple language, to bring this into terms that we're all familiar with. Food, we want to talk about food and what to eat. We want to have a happy monkey. All right, so what does that mean? What that means in the simplest way is forget all of those biochemical terms. We want you to eat vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices in infinite tasty combinations. There are so many delicious ways to eat this food. How many of you have been eating this food or at least have had some meals? I mean, all of us have had like a PB&J or a pasta primavera or a veggie sushi, right? I mean, we've all had these foods throughout our lives, but we don't think about it like that. Like my mom will be like, those apples, they're vegan. Thanks, Mom. I'm like, what did you do to the apples to make them vegan, She's so ridiculous. So we like to break rules. That's why I like working with this NASA scientist. Like he just is such a rule breaker and it makes it really fun for me because I get to break rules and have him to blame. So what we do with our cookbook, which is so crazy, there's no breakfast, lunch, dinner, snacks, or desserts. None. We didn't have any, we took out all of that because you know what? I like to eat salad for breakfast. I might be crazy. I would rather have a hot soup in the winter for breakfast filled with vegetables, nothing sweet, and that's okay. How many of you are or know of what we call a fruitopian, a fruitarian, like anyone that eats, yes, are you a fruitarian? You know people. 180 days, that's very impressive. He wants to try it so bad. So there's no rules that you can't eat fruit and get away with it. What's wrong with that? We don't need to stick to those old rules that are really set up for restaurants to know what to serve you and when, right? We want to just enjoy food. So instead, we have 4 food chapters: soup, salad, sides, and sweets. Everything boils down into that, really, if you think about it. So we're trying to have some fun. We're trying to make it, easy, less rules. Just eat healthy. Just eat vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices, and all will be well. So let's dive into the nutrition. Let's get all kind of geeky nutrition, because that is my favorite subject still, nonetheless. Now, when I made this plate, I think it was 2011. So first I had the pyramid. I did the USDA's version of a pyramid, but plant-based. And I was so excited because I got that approved to be on the cover of my very first book, and it went to print. And as it just got print, the USDA went to the plate. So the second edition has the plate. But this plate is, we use it as an example. This is not like you have to have this many servings, you have to have this every day, because again, less may be more. But if you look at the context of your overall diet, this is kind of what it could look like as a good example. So everyone agrees. The USDA, the American Institute for Cancer Research, Harvard, everyone, no one will argue against the fact, unless you're on these fringe diet things, that half of your diet, half of your plate should come from fruits and vegetables. Grandma was right, mom was right, eat your fruits and vegetables. The most health promoting food group by far, lots of color, eat the rainbow. That is where so much magic comes in, and you get the most nutritional bang for your caloric buck. So you want to get a lot of those in, as much color. It just goes along with the food triangle too, because at the apex is where all of these wonderful, delicious foods are. And then, well, Raymond came along, and again, he likes to break things. He's like, I need to fix your plate because mushrooms aren't vegetables. I'm like, what do you mean they're not vegetables? Why not? Can't they be vegetables? They are fungi. So, and they do deserve their own little section because mushrooms have a lot of medicinal properties, a lot of wonderful properties, so we do recommend those. Specifically, we're even going to make one recipe tonight, including mushrooms, and we like to use dried mushrooms. We'll talk, Ray's favorite subject is umami, so don't let him get, well, we'll let him get him started because it's a really fun topic, but mushrooms come into play when it comes to that. And then leafy greens and cruciferous also deserve their own special category on top of the other fruits and veggies because they are so extraordinary with tons of phytonutrients that are so powerful, fighting against all sorts of things, everything that's in our environment. You know, we're constantly bombarded by viruses, and I got something from my son's back to school sneezing fest he gave me, so there's always something in the environment, cancer cells that we're bombarded with every day, all that stuff. We want these powerful phytonutrients from these, especially leafy green and cruciferous vegetables, to be sitting there being our immune system. And then high fat whole, where do you get your fat from? Okay, so where do you get your fat from? We recommend getting it from nuts and seeds primarily. Also, avocados are great too, but there's a mountain of evidence showing that 1 to 2 ounces, which is like about this, about 30 to 40 grams of nuts and seeds a day are extraordinary. Very powerful cardiometabolic benefits, lots of other nutrients that you can't get elsewhere, like ellagic acid, and there's all sorts of kind of fun things in there, arginine, so stuff like that that's really good for you that you can only get exclusively from nuts and seeds. So we like to actually put them together. So my favorite thing in the world is an enormous salad, like with everything in there. I just have, that's my thing with my legumes, but he makes me the best dressings, and I got in this mission where I'm learning how to make really quick, fresh dressings with my nuts and seeds. You put that over your vegetables, you get great absorption of the vegetables, and you get you get the whole plate in your plate. It's an ideal situation. And then finally, whole grains. So whole grains, you know, they're fabulous. There's a lot of evidence about whole grains themselves, that they do have health benefits themselves. But interestingly, there is nothing unique in a whole grain that you can't get and all these other food groups. So, you know, quinoa and oats and rice and barley, whatever oats, whatever whole grains you enjoy. Now I think there's 40,000 edible grains of rice that are out there. I love purple rice. We've been going to Thailand and doing purple rice and black rice. But anyway, there's nothing you need uniquely about whole grains, but they are delicious and they're very satisfying and satiating. So they're great also culinarily speaking. So put those in there to substantiate your meals, but they're not more of a, we're gonna talk about 6 daily threes later, and I did kind of omit those, so they'll probably feel a little left out, but. All right, so if you're eating those food groups, what might be limited or missing? There are some notable nutrients. So I don't want to throw in the towel and say, eat whatever you want, you're going to be fine, because there are certain considerations. And as the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics stated, an appropriately planned vegetarian diet. But every diet, any way you eat, should be appropriately planned if you're going to be considering overall nutrition and long-term health, right? So what are those? In a plant-based diet, there's about 5 vitamins and minerals that you need to be aware of, and we're gonna go over them. So vitamins B12, D, K2, and then the minerals are iron and zinc. And then we're also gonna talk about omega-3 fatty acids after that, real quickly. All right, how many of you are all 100% plant-based? How many of you, raising your hands, are taking your B12? Great. How many of you are over 60? Well, you don't have to raise your hand if you don't want to, but we like all ages. How many of you are over 60, no matter what you're eating, and are taking a B12 supplement? Good, because there's no debate about B12, and it is a craziest thing, because I'll give you an example. First of all, B12 is made by microbes in the soil. The microbes make the B12, and then the animals have them. They're in their rumen, and it gets into the animal products. But if we wash our produce, I don't like kale that's crunchy from the dirt. Like, I wash my produce. We wash our produce a lot, so we're not getting any of those microbes. We're not getting any of that B12 in a plant-based diet. You're also not getting any B12 or you're having a harder time absorbing it after the age of 60 because intrinsic factor starts to go down. It just becomes harder to absorb. If you have any kind of GI issues, B12 is an issue across the board for everyone, particularly on a plant-based diet. It's really important. And the problem with it is there's this interesting kind of lag time where you've got B12 in your bloodstream. Let's say you were eating an omnivorous diet, and then you went plant-based. You're not going to see that deficiency show up in your blood work for 5 or maybe up to even 10 years because it doesn't show that way. Unfortunately, you can have neurological impairments before you would even see it in your blood work. And we had a client who wanted to test this theory because she was like, I don't like to swallow pills. And we're like, you have to take your B12, and this is what we recommend. And she just didn't say anything, and all of a sudden, a few months later, she started having numbness in her face, and her doctors were like, it's MS, she's got this, she's got that. We said, go get a B12 shot, because she hadn't been taking, it turns out she hadn't been taking her B12. She got lucky, though, because a lot of times it's irreversible, but she got the less in the heart, well, I guess she got lucky, but it really does happen. And I mean, half of vegans are B12 deficient, because they're just like, I'll get it from my nutritional yeast, or my plant milk, or spirulina, which actually has the opposite effect, because it has an analog, and it actually blocks the receptors for active B12. So the cheapest, safest, you can't overdose on B12. It's a water-soluble vitamin. I don't think there's one known case of B12 over toxicity. The safest, easiest, cheapest way to avoid a neurological deficiency is to pop a B12 supplement. However, it's a finicky little vitamin, and it's got a little personality problem because it likes to be absorbed in exact specific amounts. So without getting into all the details about this, we figured out we didn't figure out, but that's the actual RDA. But for a plant-based diet, this is the real calculation, is that we recommend you either, remember this, it's in our books, it's on our papers, you can find this online, it's everywhere, but it's either you do one of these 3 regimens, 50 micrograms if you want to take it twice a day, if you're really motivated and like to pop pills more than our client, or 150 microgram dose once a day, or the easiest, less pill swallowing option is 2,500 micrograms once a week. So you can just do a daily pill of 2,500 micrograms. We recommend the cyanocobalamin instead of the methylcobalamin, even though people always have these whole things about that. But it's because it's the most studied one, and it's supposed to be the most reliable. So that's enough about B12. On to vitamin D, the sunshine vitamin. Technically, this is a prohormone, right? We've got it in our skin. When UVB rays hit our skin, it gets produced, and then it gets converted in the liver and the kidneys to active vitamin D. Somehow, the whole world is having this deficiency. It's kind of like the vitamin du jour. We had this with vitamin E, we've had this with vitamin A, and now we're dealing with vitamin D. But there are a lot of data suggesting a lot of advantages to having optimal serum vitamin D levels. This is not specific to a plant-based diet. This is ubiquitous around the world. This is a global issue. It's up to like 65. I've heard 90% of people are deficient. I don't know if I think that might be exaggeration. But the point is, what we do, because it's a fat-soluble nutrient as opposed to the B12, I don't like to blindly recommend dosing on this. My clients, I have them go check their blood, and most doctors are doing that now. So next time you go to get blood work, just ask for a vitamin D if you had a 25-hydroxy D, and then once you know your levels, if you need to bring it up, you can try supplementing. You could try sun exposure, but it doesn't work for everyone. I mean, there's a lot of things. We're indoors, we're sun-phobic, we wear a lot of sunscreen, excess fat on the body will inhibit absorption, the darker skin, the more time you need outside. So there's all these different factors that come into play. It's not something you want to get you can't easily get from diet no matter what you're eating. Even if you're on an omnivorous diet and you're doing liver and whole milk and egg yolks, but that's not even ideal nutritionally speaking. So just check on that. And the vitamin K is an interesting issue because we think, oh, vitamin K, it's in your leafy green vegetables, right? You get a lot of vitamin K from especially, kale and collards and broccoli, tons of vitamin K. Anywhere you see green, you're going to get your vitamin K. However, there turns out there is another K, vitamin K2, and that's menaquinone as opposed to phyloquinone. So the menaquinone, K2, come from bacteria instead. And you could get it in some fermented foods like sauerkraut or cheese, or how many of you have ever tried natto? Do you guys like natto? I don't like it. He likes it. We were in Japan. He loved it. I don't know, not for me. I don't know how to make it either. It's kind of funky. It's got that goopy, weird. Huh?
Slimy.
Slimy. I mean, I like okra and stuff, but that was way too slimy for me. Anyway, that's one way to get your K2. However, we're seeing that there's a lot of advantages to taking K2 separately. Interestingly, when you look at the DRIs, they don't distinguish between K1 and K2. So I think a lot more studies need to be done, but the research on K2 specifically show benefit to cardiovascular, disease prevention, a lot of different things too, some cardiometabolic things, some cancer reduction in risk. So there are a lot of different reasons that we are now actually recommending people take a K2 supplement or eat their natto. And then the minerals. So zinc is an essential mineral, right? We need it for immune function. You always hear about that, those zinc lozenges and stuff like that. It's important for neurological function, for growth. Plant sources are nuts and seeds. Those are great sources, and also legumes. Oh, I forgot to talk about legumes with the plate. Oh, we'll have to come back to that. I love legumes. Okay, so we'll talk about that. But because of possible absorption issues, so the foods that have those, the nuts and seeds and the legumes also have a lot of fiber and also have these things called phytates, so it may inhibit the absorption of all the zinc. So because of that, it's potentially, you could fall short on it. You don't necessarily need to supplement, but be aware of it and make sure you're getting your 1 to 2 ounces of nuts and seeds a day and your 1 to 1.5 cups of legumes a day. Well, I'll just talk about it because I love legumes. So legumes are beans, any kind of bean, lentils, peas, like chickpeas, cowpeas I just learned about because spending time in the South with him, and hummus should be a food group. In fact, if you go to, I dare you all to go to howdoyouhummus.com, and then we'll talk. howdoyouhummus.com. Okay, and then also soy foods like tofu and tempeh also count for your servings of legumes a day. So that's 1 to 1.5 cups a day. Okay, but I digress. Anyway, iodine. Iodine is interesting. Iodine is, we had big issues with iodine. It's important for your thyroid and for immune function and other things. But you guys remember that we started fortifying salt because there was a lot of iodine deficiency. But what's happened in recent years?
Gourmet salt.
Yes, fancy salts. Everyone's eating, Himalayan pink salt and black salt and red salt and this salt and that salt, and we're not doing iodized salt. And also, a lot of people are concerned about their salt because of hypertension and all that, so a lot of people are now having issues with iodine deficiency. Interestingly, I've been seeing a lot of goiters for the first time in a long time. So that's become more common, probably because of this. Now, the interesting thing is you don't want too much iodine. Just because something's good doesn't mean more is better, because too much is also a problem. Adults need about 150 micrograms a day. It might be ideal if you're worried about the sodium. So if you're not worried about the sodium, use a pinch of the iodized salt when you do salt. Or if you are worried about the sodium, you may consider supplementing with iodine too. So you could get all of those things in one little gentle kind of multivitamin. That's what we recommend. The other thing you could do is sea vegetables. The problem with sea vegetables, they're delicious. Not everyone likes sea flavoring. My children included. But the other problem with them is it's not reliable. The dosing could be like really high, like kelp high, like crazy high, dangerously high, and it could be like just unreliable in terms of what's on the label and what you're actually getting. So I think the safest way is to include some sea vegetables if you enjoy them, and considering supplementing. I don't like recommending a ton of supplements. We do one multivitamin and call it a day, and don't have to worry about any of this stuff. Okay, and the final nutrient that we're going to discuss is, we're going to go back to the macros, forgive me, but this is about omega-3 fatty acids. So basically, we have 2 fats that are essential in the diet, okay? The omega-3s and the omega-6 fats. Those are the 2 fats that we need in our diet for everything. Like, that's the only thing we don't need saturated fat. We don't need monounsaturated fat, though it might be somewhat beneficial. But omega-3 is an interesting issue. It's an interesting issue in a plant-based diet, because basically there's 3 forms. I'm going to try to do this without making it too gruelingly geeky. But ALA, alpha-linolenic acid, is the original plant compound. It's the stuff we find in flaxseed, chia seed, hemp seed, walnuts, soy food. That's where we find the ALA. Now, what happens is we take in the ALA, and our body makes it longer into EPA, and then longer into DHA. Now, it turns out we need all 3 forms and all the intermediary forms as well, for different reasons. They have different functions in the body. And if you're not consuming the EPA and DHA already preformed like you would if you had fish, so anyone that's not consuming fish for any reason, you're not getting those longer chain fats, the EPA and DHA. So when you test the blood of someone that doesn't eat fish, you're gonna find lower levels of the longer elongated versions of this. Does that matter? We don't know, because people on a vegan diet tend to have a decreased risk of cardiovascular disease anyway, and maybe even a decreased risk for Alzheimer's, things that are associated with this nutrient. So the question remains, does it matter if we have lower levels? If it matters, and we're seeing some evidence to support the idea that taking the microalgae, which is where the fish get the EPA and DHA from, you know, like a microalgae plant-based supplement of EPA and DHA, it may be beneficial. So we also recommend that if you're interested. But other than that, you're gonna get everything, and you can get ALA. The other way you can get more of the EPA and DHA, by the way, is increasing or doubling your amount of ALA. So just eating more flax, chia, hemp, soy foods, and walnuts. So we don't know if it's a problem quite yet. All right, and finally, I want to talk about the 6 daily threes. So, like I said, the whole grains aren't necessary in the diet. You don't have to have them. They're wonderful if you enjoy them. But I like to use the 6 daily threes as things to prioritize. Well, you're looking at all these vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices, and all of these amazing recipes that you're like, ooh, what do I eat? What should I eat? How do you make sure you're getting all you need? And basically, it comes down to this. And this is on our website. In fact, we just have it. We have a new website. It just went up this week, healthspansolution.com. And there's a whole post about this where I kind of took a sample. If you do like 6 daily threes means 3 servings of these 6 things, and one of them is not food, it's exercise, but the other 5 are things that I want you to think about on a daily basis. Again, nutrition's not an emergency. You don't have to have all of this every day. It doesn't have to be perfect by any means, but this is something as a guideline. So I have magnets. You can just put this up. You can print this up and put it on your fridge so you remember, did I have my 3 servings of leafy greens and cruciferous vegetables today? That should be cruciferous too. Did I have 3 other servings of other colored vegetables today? Did I have 3 servings of fruits, 3 servings of nuts and seeds, 3 servings of legumes? So, and then get moving. Just, use your walking, if you guys have pedometers, or this thing drives me crazy because I'm like such a competitor, so I'm like, I gotta get my steps in. But all those things that motivate you just to get moving, those are the things to kind of think about as prioritizing for what you're gonna consume on a regular basis. So with a little bit of mindfulness on those key nutrients, that's really all you have to be considered about, and it's not that much, really, if you think about the standard American diet or standard Western diet now. With eating this diet, eating vegetables, fruits, whole grains, legumes, mushrooms, nuts, seeds, herbs, and spices, minding your B12, making sure your D is normal, and making sure you're getting adequate sources of those other few nutrients, this is what is promised to you, almost. A reduced risk for, well, let me go in order. It's basically, there's a lot of evidence, and this is actually the most substantiated. There is way more evidence out there on other things like autoimmune diseases and all sorts of things that are developing. It's really exciting. But basically what we know really pretty confidently is that plant-based diets are associated with lower body mass index and lower body fat, lower overall mortality, and lower mortality from ischemic heart disease, reduced medication requirements. I love to say results are typical. Like, you guys know those commercials where it's like, results aren't typical at the end of the medication? And it's like, ooh, a little disclaimer. Well, this is the stuff we see with our clients. They get off their medications. We see this all the time. It is the most, I never saw that. I didn't learn this in grad school. This wasn't possible. Like, once you have this disease, I remember when I was personal training and while I was in graduate school, I'd be so happy when my client would go to the doctor and they didn't have to increase their medication dose, or they lost a couple pounds. It wasn't like, oh, my doctor says I don't need this anymore. Like, that actually really happens, and it's pretty extraordinary. Also, reduced risk of certain cancers, especially colorectal cancer, reduced incidence of hypertension, hyperglycemia, and hyperlipidemia, reduced obesity, inflammatory markers, reversal. It's the only diet ever shown to reverse advanced stage cardiovascular disease and type 2 diabetes. Do any of you know anyone that's had that happen, that you've witnessed? Did you ever imagine to see that? It's extraordinary. People that are so sick getting healthy, it's amazing. I'm a believer. I never saw that before. So basically, we like to say that a plant-based diet supports living longer, not just living longer, which is the whole basis for what we're talking about with Healthspan. So what is our take-home message on what we can do to mitigate the continued diet-induced health decline? First, it's time to stop defending a plant-based diet as adequate, even though I kind of did today, but I'm also saying that I need to not worry. We don't need to worry about getting enough, because perhaps less is actually more. It may be superior because of what is naturally restricted in there. The only way we've consistently extended lifespan and health span in any organism tested, from yeast to primates, is with dietary restriction without malnutrition. So less may be more, and a whole food plant-based diet may be the most efficient, the easiest way to accomplish this goal, what we're learning in the lab with these lessons. So we want to return the dialogue back to food and stop talking about all this biochemistry terminology that are so confusing. We want you to enjoy food. These are all recipes from our new book, and we had so much fun having to come up with 100 recipes in, 4 weeks? We ate ourselves to pieces, but it was really fun. And we can't wait to share it with you. And we wanted to share these. These are the links if you want to take a picture. All 4 of those are the direct links. Remember, they're case sensitive to our papers that are they're online. So that was the one that connected Ray and I, the plant-based nutrition one, and then we did one together in the geriatric journal, the Journal of Geriatric Cardiology, basically a summary for physicians and healthcare professionals. You know, when people come to me and say, my doctor says I can't go plant-based, we're like, well, here, give them these resources, because, you know, there's 200 plus references there. And then these are the 2 papers that Ray wrote before I met him that are absolutely mind-blowing. I still read it. I don't know, I've read it dozens of times and learned something new each time. So those are pretty extraordinary. So
the big win for plants is that the Journal of Geriatric Cardiology,
Oh.
our paper is the most downloaded paper in the history of the journal by a lot. So we're over 100,000 downloads now, and the next nearest one, which is also a plant-based paper, but the next nearest one is like 10,000. So a lot of people out there are looking at it. It's referenced all over Game Changers. If you go to the Game Changer website, they used it a lot there. How many people have seen Game Changers? So it's really,
it's coming out on Netflix, I think, next week. I haven't seen it yet.
But it's really neat to see that so many people are starting to get into this. And both of those 2 papers on the right-hand side are made to be able to go
Left.
to your, I'm sorry, to your,
They're left.
oh yeah, you're left, I'm sorry. Both of those are meant that you can take it at your office visit, and if you're talking to your physician, because recognize it's not that they're bad or evil or you know, under the big pharma or conspiracy. They just don't learn it this way, and it may not be familiar. Remember what I said to you guys, you know, if they don't believe you're really going to change your diet, then the responsible thing to do is to prescribe you the drug, right? But that's the ethical thing for them to do. But if you bring those things to them, help them as well, and it can be a journey together, and they see you get better, you may be the person that's the tipping point so that they start recommending things in the future.
I think that's what's happened. There's been, like, over the years, like hundreds and hundreds and thousands more doctors and dietitians teaching plant-based nutrition, and it's because their patient went home, they said to go take their medicine, they went home, changed their diet, got better, and told their doctor, and they're like, oh, that could happen, and then when they were open-minded enough, it kind of like was a wonderful domino effect. So it's pretty exciting.